Our next panel is on risk and informal cities. I will quickly invite our panelists. Mr. Prasad Shetty, an urban planner and founder faculty at School of Environment and Architecture. Mr. Maheep Singh Thapar, an urban planner and a consultant to state governments on several master plans of cities in India. Mr. Rama Sangye, a housing rights and education activist, and Dr. Anant Maringanti. I invite all our panelists to kindly come on the dais.
Very quickly, I have to make a confession. The confession is that this panel is actually a merger of two panels. And we had to do that because, as I told you in the morning, a pilot went missing. Prasad Shetty was supposed to reach here around 9 o'clock, and I think he ended up here at 11 o'clock along with Amita. Luckily, by the time Amita reached here, the panel was still going on, so we could just put Amita on the panel. But we had to actually cancel the panel in the morning, which was supposed to be on informal cities. The idea essentially was that there is a lot that is going on in cities that we do not know about, that we do not formally talk about, we do not record, we do not know what is really going on, and the archives don't exist very easily. A lot of these things that happen in cities are place-based. They happen in neighborhoods, they happen in localities, and we have lost ways of understanding those, recording those, analyzing those as part of the city's dynamics. So when I think about Hyderabad, for example, I can only think about Amirpet, I can think about Tegalkunta, I can think about Bholakpur, I can think about so many neighborhoods, each of which had a very different trajectory, very different history, and very different prospects in this thing that we are calling globalization. Just to give you a very dramatic sense of what this means, when we started our work in this neighborhood called Bholakpur, which is basically a scrap market, an entire municipal ward of about 70,000 people living there, we discovered that the scrap merchants there, many of them actually follow London Metal Exchange. They know the rates, they know how the prices change, they know how what is happening in the Middle East can affect their lives, because the leather that they used to export would get stuck in some airport and their entire life prospects can change overnight because of some war that has started in the Middle East. They know what is happening in the US, they know what's happening in the UK, they know all of that. And one of the things that they told me almost in a very ironical manner, that साहब ये mortgage crisis जो हुई ना US में 2008 में, उससे हमको बहुत फायदा हुआ है. फायदा क्यों हुआ है? It is because a number of companies in Hyderabad which were BPOs and doing outsourced offshore services had to shut down overnight, and they threw out all their furniture, and the furniture is then purchased by the scrap merchants, right? So the ways in which places are deeply embedded in global networks, but we don't think about them as part of the global. And it's important for us to think about what becomes understood as global in the formal valorized sense, and what is actually quite global but never gets talked about. So that was partly the idea of the panel that we wanted to do in the morning, which is to think about places in different cities, and that was the reason why we put Ramaswamy, who knows Calcutta almost like the back of his palm for the last 30-40 years, and Prasad Shetty, who knows Bombay likewise very, very intimately. That was the idea. The afternoon's panel was called Risk and the City. And there were two different kinds of thinking behind this. One is that we're talking about precariousness, precarity, instability, things that break down on a day-to-day basis, at a time when worldwide people are saying that we need to think about climate change. And we think about climate change as something that can happen in the next 60 years, 70 years, 100 years. That's the time horizons in which you do it. And your modeling doesn't quite tell you exactly what is likely to happen. At some level, we are saying that something terrible could happen in the next 60 years. That's the status of our current modeling capabilities. That's the status of our current data. We're saying that 30, 40, 50, 60 years, this place may just completely disappear, right? And that gives you a certain sense of urgency, but with the urgency, we don't know how to translate that into any kind of action because we can't quite visualize what that means. And one of the constant debates that we keep having in any conversation around climate change is that यार मैं सुबह उठता हूँ तो मेरे बच्चे के सर्टिफिकेट्स पानी में भीगो के कहीं पे पिघल जाएंगे, मेरा घर जल सकता है, I could fall into a sewage manhole and die. That's the everyday risks and uncertainties that I am facing. आप कह रहे हैं कि 60 साल के अंदर दुनिया का गोल हो सकता है. No, how do I even think about it? Why should I act on that? Right? So the part of the challenge here is to think about how do we bring together risk, threat that happens at very different, almost incommensurable time horizons and scales. How do we make them become make them part of our everyday story, right? What kinds of knowledge do we need to produce and so on? And part of that conversation then led to a very interesting comment that Mahip made last week, and that is where everything has come together for this panel. He said maybe we are actually over investing in our cities. Maybe we are putting too many eggs in one basket and we are risking just too much in doing this. Maybe we are actually asking for serious trouble and we don't know how to deal with that. And that's not a technical problem, it's a political problem. It needs to be thought about by everyone and altered. So that is the provocation with which I wanted to start this. And I'm going to ask Mahip now to show some images and make the point that he wants to make, and then we will take it from there.
I'm an urban planner and I run a planning consulting company, and for the last 18 years or so we've been working on a lot of work in Hyderabad and then projects, plans. Recently we worked on the Bangalore master plan. We also do a lot of related stuff which is urban related, and most of our advisory is to the government, but we use technology called GIS. It is embedded in our process. So when we do these plans, one is what is required by the client and what is statutory requirement, but a lot of other ideas come to us and we realize what's going on. We try to understand what's going on. So will you help me? Thank you. So while urbanization is important, it's a phenomenon which cannot be stopped, it's an economic growth, it's political, but the fallouts are quite visible now. And so when we see that people are increasing, one big indicator is that the population of each city is increasing. Why is it increasing? Who are these people coming into the cities? Because it's not natural growth. Natural growths are stabilizing. There are people coming from other parts of the state or the country or from different countries. So what kind of urban future we want, an urban form we want, the livability, when we say what's the built environment or the related social issues or the facilities we want, the way we want to live our lives, is not really in our control anymore. So we say the market forces and economic forces are controlling that. The Sustainable Development Goals talks about so many goals, out of which specific goal number 11 is about livability. I'll have a minute on that. Then yeah, that's inclusive, safe, resilient, sustainable. Next. So these are also questions that we want to make these cities inclusive for whom, safe from whom. So is it human versus human, or climate versus, or environment versus human, or development versus environment? Is it machine versus human? Because the accidents which happen, which lead to deaths or disabilities, are maybe vehicle hitting a human being, and in that vehicle there is a human being. So if we have, probably in the future we'll have driverless vehicles, it will be a vehicle and human being. We hope it does not happen. So resilient and sustainable. Next. So what we see is that as the population grows, a large section of the population continues to remain in unlivable conditions, and largely it is related to the economic status of the, largely it is related to that, and the statistics are all available, and the pressure on water supply or drinking water, or just the pressure of the throwing out that water in the form of wastewater or sewage, how to handle it, it just keeps increasing, and that becomes a larger public health risk as the size of the city increases or the population grows. Next. the global data is very clear that while the cities generate so much economy, they give jobs, there's a lot of wealth there, but they also generate most of the greenhouse emission gases and garbage, some billions of tons, and they also consume so much energy. So cities are also energy guzzlers and resource guzzlers for the region and states and countries. Next. While we are not very comfortable about things which are happening now because we are not able to manage them, the projections are even worse in one way, which look good, that the economic growth will keep growing, but the population is yet to grow for India. So for India, I think the best and the worst is yet to begin. So probably it's going to be 2030 and onwards when things are going to get much difficult, much more. That's what the graph shows. Next. So we have primate cities in our country. Many countries in the world have that. One big city in a big state, or a state with one big city. And the average, we see that in whether it was the combined state of AP or now Telangana, Hyderabad is 1 crore, Warangal is 10 lakhs, 1/10. It's just 2 hours from here. So while we talk of conurbations where cities just grow and join with each other, or there are strips of development along the highways or transport corridors, but it's just too much of an imbalance in a region you look at it from a regional perspective. So while big cities are growing and continue to grow, they become attractive for people, for everybody to come. So I call them attractive cities. So in the last discussion in Delhi when we were talking about smart cities, somebody says dumb cities. So we can have new terminology: smart city, dumb city, attractive city, good city, bad city, risky city. But cities are always economic growth centers, and they always give us an opportunity to make a livelihood. How we use the money, how we spend it, how we live, it's dependent on various factors. So health issues and stress is increasing now. It's being documented, and after the news on Delhi on pollution, it's becoming more and more evident. But it was something which we knew all the time. So I was driving out of Vijayawada day before night, and it was full of smoke. So you just couldn't breathe that. There was garbage being burned, there were tires being burned, there was dust on the road, there was smoke pollution. It was really bad. So the accidents and fatalities are increasing now. So if you have a pressure on a particular system, whether it's a road system or a rail system, it automatically adds to the risk of the accident. And while there is data that on some highways, including the outer ring road of Hyderabad, that the number of accidents are decreasing because of better design, but still human lives are being lost. So, and there's a quality of life can be discussed on various parameters, but it's a very mechanical life. When we spend in big cities, we travel more just to go to our workplace and come back home. So about 1.5 to 3 hours, which is extremely inefficient and bad. What impact it has on the psyche of the individual or the society as a whole is, we need to talk about that next. So just we now skip through some images because I think I'll be covering most of my views through this, and then others can speak and I'll take questions and we'll have a discussion on it. What we miss is sometimes the basics. Delhi, which is growing, it's not a city anymore, it's cities and cities together, and it cuts across 4 or 5 states, and it's a region now, but it continues to grow. So who will manage these cities? How will we manage them? They are physically continuous, different states, different. So if you have a large municipal corporation which is supposed to provide, these are structured organizations as per the laws, the statutes. Who is going to do what? So if you have 5,000 people working in a particular municipal corporation today for a 1 crore population city, if it becomes 2 crores, will those 5,000 be sufficient? Do we need another 5,000? Do we need another 10,000 buses? Or do we use technology and reduce the number of people working? How are you going to manage these cities? Delhi is about 200 meters above sea level. We know about the earthquake risk of Delhi, but it continues to grow. There are other cities in the world which are Japan and San Francisco. We know they are different. I'm talking about our own cities in India. We are talking about India. We are talking about our cities, our problems. Pollution is now a big problem. So schools were shut for 7 days. So interestingly, if all the powerful people, I had a discussion in Delhi during that time, if they sit and make rules and laws for the rest of the country, and they pollute the same air. It's interesting, really interesting. And nobody wants to leave Delhi. But so that was a great time for people who said, we want livable cities. They should just say, okay, now I want to go. But we don't have the options. If people had the options, I think people would start moving out of. Some people, 10%, 5%, that will make a big difference. Crime, in the last month, there's a lot of data in the newspaper about crime in the city. So Delhi is supposed to be the high. How can we forget the terrain in which we live on and we are living in this kind of city? The plateau, it just slopes, then picks up from there, like goes up to 900 meters, like here. It's a plateau at 900 meters. So the city is now constantly growing at 900 meters. So if your water supply is source of river, at least half of that. We assume that there is a river at 500 meters of sea level. Still you have to pump water from that 400 meters. A lot of energy. So that on those parameters, any city will never be sustainable. It keeps changing temperature, which is some cities in the northeast or in stations, including Bangalore. There were no fans. It is better. No heating. Now 36 to 39 degrees. A lot of AC. A lot of pollen and other things. Then that's natural stuff. The lake is about 6 to 10 meters long. So if there is a wave, you don't need a tsunami. But the rain, you can't slow down the water to go out. The city is at risk. But many cities are at risk. The biggest cities in the world are on. You can't face the risk of Mumbai, same, all is a problem. There's too much. There's 6 meters, nothing to wait for a wave to come. It's so inundate both cities. When we say it's a temporary problem, it's a resilient city. We can face it. It's a matter of a month. And 11 months a year we go back. And that photograph is interesting. And most of the cities have that. In the physical form itself is so you can see highlights and waters of sun. We had old cities with the plant, right angle, three-diamond, commodity range. And Indian cities don't have commodity range. Now, next. So these are the three planned so-called grid cities which were implemented. There are many other cities which were planned which were not implemented. Now Naya Raipur and all are coming, but Chandigarh, parts of Bhubaneswar was planned by Königsberger. Correct? Königsberger. Königsberger, oh right. So, and he wrote the book on climatology. We don't know much about Bhubaneswar because it's not publicized. And of course Gandhinagar, next. Next please. Yeah. Barcelona is dense mix, grid with a diagonal. Next. This is a typical community in the US. Next. So is this planned and well planned, well managed? Is this the way we want it? Next. What is the urban form we want? What kind of pressures does India have? This is the kind of image which comes. This is Vijayawada. Mumbai, I think you can see, make out from the trains. The traffic in Hyderabad. Next. This is the sprawl and the physical. This is Hyderabad again, the bottom image. Next. There was a disaster on Footover Bridge some time back. Was it too many people in too less space? So just congestion itself is risky. There is too many. How much infrastructure can you build? How many lanes can you keep widening in a city? 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 to 12. Next please. So there have been a lot of policies and impetus on urban issues and all that, but somehow as long as the city sizes keep increasing, so it's not anti-urbanization. I am an urban planner. So I feel that unless we have a regional framework, let the cities grow. but unless you reverse the trend in a different way, we can't stop city size or population size in Indian cities. But the time has come for us to look at a larger regional urban pattern. So automatically the risk, I'm not even talking about the risk of big disasters, man-made disaster, or war, terrorism. You just have too many people in the cities. Now if you have a very large infrastructure setup or a IT company which provides jobs to 20,000 people, it's becoming a national asset and a national risk. I mean, it's under threat. So you need CISF to guard them, whether it's an airport or IT SEZ. So lots of complications are now getting added, and there are a lot of risk factors inherent in urban living. But while we cannot do away with that, we get adjusted to it. I think it's time we start a discussion on what we can do about it. Thank you.
I'd like to talk about something quite different, a different view of the city, from inside, as a resident and citizen of that city. Risk. A few years back, I did an interview with a political scientist and close friend, Dr. Ranabir Samadar. So we were doing, the subject of the interview was protests in Calcutta in the period 1987 to 2007, during that 20-year span. So we were talking about the city, and he was a Naxalite activist in the 60s, and before that, a student activist in Presidency College. So he was talking about the perception of the city by people like him at that time. And he said that there was no such thing as risk. You had an idea and you did it. You didn't think about, oh, what will happen to my career, or oh, what will...
Sachinto, my friend, who was a photographer, he wanted to be a photographer, and he saw the work of a documentary and street photographer, an American, and he said, this is me, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. So he was just driven by his passion and inspiration. So there's risk and there is something else, and these may change, but subliminally you may have these elements still in the city. Let me give you two examples. I got into public activism in 1984 when I met an architect and city planner called Jai Sen. He came to Calcutta. Sorry. Right.
We come here.
I have a friend and former colleague called Jai Sen. He was an architect. He came to Calcutta from Canada in the mid-70s, and then he started an organization called Unayan, which functioned for the next 20 years. It came about before this term NGOs existed. They were called social action groups or volunteer organizations. So they worked in Calcutta, and he wrote an essay called The Unintended City. In that he said that the common view of Calcutta is a city of intellectuals, poets, colonial capital city, all that. But hidden within this city is another city which is of the workers in the city. And they are not intended by the city. The city needs their services and their work. But the city does not have space for them in any way. So he wanted to look at the unintended city and the dynamics and the form and the relations and the logistics of that unintended city. And then he also saw that a certain part of the city, its east, was going to go through rapid development with a major highway built and real estate development and all foreseen. So he saw the east of the city as going through rapid development in the coming days, and he wanted to make an intervention into the planning of the city of the future, so that the voices of the laboring poor of the city or of the eastern part of the city could enter the planning process and make an impact, so that their life in that part of the city does not mirror the life of the rest of the city, where workers constantly had to be evicted and to face the authorities negatively. So he wanted this to be a more inclusive city. So again, he had the gumption to have such a vision and to start an organization and actually begin to work with that. But 20 years after he founded Unnayan, and I have been mentored by him, I set up an organization called Howrah Pilot Project in the Shibpur neighborhood of Howrah, near Calcutta. And so I had a vision. I thought I was going to transform my city physically and in every way by working in the bastis or slums. And I thought I would initiate the redevelopment of the basti, not by a promoter or by the government, but by the community themselves, and that could be a model for slum redevelopment across the city. And Calcutta has a very large proportion of its area devoted to bastis, which are a colonial legacy. So all the bastis would be transformed in an inclusive way and at the behest of those who dwell. So that was a huge gumption, and within a short time after I started working, I realized what a pipe dream that was, and I should abandon it. So it was out of a sense of failure. But we started doing something else. We set up a school for those children who don't go to school. And that school became a kind of community center and a means of voluntary action by the educated youth of the basti. And they've been doing it for 20 years and earned a huge amount of goodwill or soft power in that neighborhood, with thousands of the youth of that basti being former students of our school. So now we have a major issue coming up and a huge conflict on a piece of land that somebody wants to give to us to start a school, and there are lots of vested interests who don't want that to happen. So we are completely marginalized in that basti in terms of the support we have or don't have, but they don't count on the support that we have invisibly through all our students, and so they are our strength. So those people who oppose us, they are fighting for their lives because they know that they're going to become completely marginal in this environment because our group has taken over. And they are fighting for their life. Whereas for us, if we don't get that land, it doesn't matter. We have survived for 20 years without it, and we can survive another 20 years. But the things have swung, and actually when we started the school, that was also at the background in our minds, to think of the long-term future and to seed the future of that basti by teaching small children, and that one day they would be the youth of the basti. At this point, I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Concepts on informality and one story on risk and adaptability. I'm not going to kind of argue for the efficiency or usability, etc., or the relevance of informality. I think that is something which is already kind of known to this audience. One thing is I'm going to make it clear that we all live lives through formal and informal systems on an everyday basis. I mean, we move through informal and formal systems, constantly, like our clothes and everything. Whatever we kind of consume through the day passes through series of formal and informal systems. So we live life. So I do not want to kind of separate the two, except for kind of saying that informality has a certain form. I'll come to it in a moment. And the practices are not encoded through writing. They are not legislated. They are not necessarily written law. There are no written laws for informality to work itself out. So two concepts emerge from there. The first one I will kind of speak about something. The first concepts we are working through a number of field work. So the first idea is the idea around transactional capacities. When I use the term form, urban form, I mean a very distinguishable physicality of space. For example, if you're walking through a slum, you can understand the physicality. When you're walking through a plotted development, you know what is the physicality. You walk through a set of in old cities, you know what the physicality is. So that is the form. That is form. Every form has a capacity to transact. Forms have capacity to transact. They have a transaction capacity. What is transaction capacity? Transaction capacity is the amount of transactions that are possible within that the form can afford. Real transactions, but also the amount of diversity that form can hold, the amount of safety it can provide, the amount of resources, less number amount of resources that it uses to kind of and all of those things. So the argument I'm trying to make is that if you have a range between an apartment and a slum, in between there are low-rise buildings, and there are university buildings and slum. The slum appears to have the highest transaction capacity. And to demonstrate it, this small example, imagine a street with a boundary wall on the edge. You walk, and what you see is maybe there is a sidewalk. And you walk along the street, you see a boundary wall. Behind the boundary wall, maybe there is an office building or an apartment or somebody's house or whatever, industry. That condition has the least transaction capacity. If there were some shops on it, if there are some houses on it, if it is corroded, if the edge of the street is corroded, then it has a higher transaction capacity. Now, higher the transaction capacity, the better the form, because it can afford much more. It provides safety, it provides care, it provides immense opportunity, it allows many more people to inhabit it, occupy it, and it also uses much less resources. So, and the argument I'm making is informality produces a form with very high transaction capacity. Okay, that is one idea. The second idea is the elasticity in practice. When there are unwritten rules, which is common in all informal transactions, when the rules are unwritten, then the practice has an elasticity. You can negotiate, you can change on the spot. You can kind of you can do many more things. You can keep on evolving. You can keep on kind of changing. And that is very useful because And that really is the crux of the matter, that the rules become, when they become very hard, they become difficult for many lives to live, you know. Informality provides for this rules which are spongy, which allows for higher elasticity in practice. So I think these two concepts I want to kind of, you know, throw at the audience at the moment: transactional capacity and higher elasticity of practice. One small story on risk and resilience. You know, since 2005, Mumbai every year has floods, our experience of floods, or the fear of floods. So I think in 2008 or 9 or something, there was also a smaller flood-like condition, and one of my friends lost his truck. You know, he's a transporter. He's kind of, you know, he owns a truck, and the truck broke down and kind of. It was an old truck, but he kind of lost it. He bought it second hand, he lost the truck. And then this guy wanted to buy another truck. And, you know, the banks, there is a practice in banks that they do not give loans to one, transporters, and two, to Bollywood. Bollywood. They don't give loans. Banks don't trust. So he didn't get the loan from it. Then he tried looking for, you know, loans, or when I say loans, I mean commercial loans, 14%. 14 to 18%. Then he tried looking for private loans, you know. There are a lot of people who give private loans. Those were between 40 to 60%, so completely unaffordable. Then there were these kind of, you know, in Bombay, I think they're there in many cities, there are this kind of immediate loan requirements, please contact so and so, there are these kind of. Usually they kind of, they service very small, you know, loan seekers. So this guy, it seems, called one of those numbers, you know. And the person who picked up on the list said that, you know, you have a requirement of 18 to 20 lakhs, something like that. We can't provide, but I know somebody who will help you with this. And then that loan is an interesting story, because that loan is, so he goes to this broker, this kind of an agent, loan agent. And this loan agent says that, we can get you a house loan. Because house loan is something which is at between 8 to 10%, so it is cheaper. And, you know, you can be organized. The problem is you need a house for that. You need to kind of have a house to get that loan. So then he says that there is he also kind of, the same broker kind of said that there is another, you know, there's a developer on the outskirts of Mumbai region who will give you a house. Give you a house means give you papers of the house. Make papers, and then you can get them registered, and then you can kind of, you know, give the papers to the bank, and then you can get your loan. So basically, this guy will take 5% of the loan. So that was kind of like the developer will take 5% of the loan, because he's also doing big risk, because the same house will be again sold to another 4 people who will require loans. And so this guy kind of, you know, goes and the deal is made, the papers are registered, stamp duty is paid, and then, you know, submit it to the, and then they approach a very small cooperative bank, Kapoor Bank, which is kind of where there is a person planted inside, or there is a person who's another friend who's kind of, you know, who kind of facilitates the paperwork in the bank. The loan requires 2 other things, of course. The mortgage, the house loan requires mortgage, which is the house. But it also requires guarantor, which is easy, kind of, you need a friend who can guarantee. But you need paying capacity, you need to show paying capacity. Then this agent kind of organizes another agent who kind of sets up an enterprise to establish paying capacity. The way they do it is very interesting. They say the enterprise is 1 year old, so you don't have tax returns. What you need is invoices and bills, which are easy to kind of put together. And then you have a space. You go, you sit there for 7 days, 8 days, and typically the enterprise is selling lingerie. Why? Because the person who comes to inspect will not ask for a price. Otherwise, if there is some other material, you can say, I want 2 of this and 3 of this. But usually, so it's kind of worked out. And the thing, paying capacity is established, the cooperative bank kind of yields newspaper, the developer kind of, produces the paper, the loan is got, and then there is a 6-7%, cost of the loan. But then you get a loan at 10% interest. But cheap. When I asked him, what if any of these 4 people who have taken loans on that house defaults? If any of them default, so he said, how is it possible to default? How can you default? There's a matter of high trust. You can't default the payment. We only give to only trusted people. Thank you very much.
All right. I'm going to summarize 3 very different points of view on the city. And I want that then to open up some conversation. Vanshika, who is supposed to be the timekeeper, how many more minutes do we have? 10 minutes? 10 minutes. So we'll have to wrap up in 10 minutes. So, when Ramaswamy first told me about this place in Howrah Pilot, the Howrah Pilot project, he actually gave me something to remember in mind. He called it Field of Dreams, the movie by Kevin Costner, in which the guy goes and actually builds a baseball field. And he just waits for people to come. It's a place somewhere outside where nobody goes. You do it because something tells you that it needs to be done. Right? It's a story of faith, conviction. You're not thinking about anything else. You're not thinking about risk. You're not making calculations. You're just not making calculations, and that's the most important thing. You're saying that this is something that needs to be done. I have faith in it. I have conviction in it. I have dreamt of this. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to do it, and I want to see it happen. That's one way in which cities are made. That's one way in which people actually come into the city because they're driven by aspirations, dreams. They come here and do things. They see possibilities. And then you have another point of view, another way of thinking about the city as something which can be rationally produced. Something where we can calculate. We can actually calculate how many people can a place reasonably hold. When do we know that beyond this number, this city is not workable anymore? If you go beyond this, if you have this many more people, then it's going to collapse, right? There's a way to calculate that, and that's one way of thinking about the city. And then there is another way of thinking about the city, which is that things happen. Things happen because people are alive. It's the lived city. You make adjustments, you make calculations in a particular moral framework of living with other people. You know that there are other people alongside you. You're not alone. And a friend of mine put this very beautifully. He said that these are cities in which people walk all over each other without trampling anyone. Right? You walk all over each other without trampling anyone, and I think that's a very, very important aspect of this. बहुत सारे झूठ भी बोल देते हैं, but it is not like you are trying to destroy anything. You are झूठ इसलिए बोल रहे हैं ताकि the day you must get through the day. You must get somehow get things done. That's one way in which we actually manage to live in cities on which we don't have and whole lot of control. बारिश गिरा तो गिरा, बाढ़ आ गया तो आ गया है, निकाल लेंगे. Try and figure out how to survive. And I think that the beauty and the horror of cities is that all of these are possible ways of being in the city. There is no one single way. And that is what makes our cities actually viable. And we need to think about each of them. Each of them has a certain validity, a certain truth claim that comes with it. And we need to figure out at what point of time do we need to do what. So I'll stop there. I don't want to draw this to any singular conclusion because that is not what our cities are about. It is about the kind of things that we want to do. And we need to try and figure out what those ways of being in the city are. So, I want to open this up for any kind of questions, comments in the next 5-6 minutes, and then we can close this and move on to the next session. Prashant, and then we'll start from here. I'll pick up those two.
So, my first question is actually to the first speaker. Do you think the past of cities has any role to play in the future of cities?
I saw two hands go up there, yes.
So my question was for the informality and the elasticity point that Sir raised. I'm asking this question in context of informality in urban spaces also very often leads to going back to the very rigid systems of certain set patterns of caste and class. If you take waste management or if you take waste management, inevitably the manual scavengers that still do exist in urban spaces will be the lowest castes. And so inevitably certain professions will be related to certain castes and certain professions that come by way of birth. So in that sense, in what terms does informality not facilitate but creates a hindrance in the development of a city?
Okay, there's one there. Lingaraj.
So if you look at most of what's happening in the cities in terms of its dynamism or informal ways of living and being, it's happening in spite of planning, not because of planning. Right? If you look at it because of Bangalore, 50-60% of water supply is from informal sector. It's not planned. It's the UWSC supply coverage is only 50% of supply. The 50% is the informal tanker supply. Waste management, 60-70% is done by the informal sector, the waste pickers communities. So why plan?
Perfectly valid question.
I have an answer.
Okay, there's one question here and then we will get back to the panel.
Venu wants to say. Venu?
When you have something to say?
Quick question. I was just curious.
There's a mic coming from behind you.
I was just curious. There's a small distinction that you probably make in your formulation of plans between, let's say, urban density and infrastructure as being two different things. So if you're saying that like we're over-investing in cities, that's probably coming from a space of thinking about surplus value, which is really creating new hard surfaces, and build volume, as opposed to talking about this human geography, which is density of a different kind. So those would point towards two very different kinds of problems.
Okay, so one question there in the back.
My question is to the first speaker. If you look at cities like Barcelona, Barcelona especially has implemented something called as super blocks, where you have certain grids, right? So they are blocked off for fossil fuel run vehicles are not allowed, and they have to take a long route and then wire around the city. So this kind of a solution, this is basically to kind of increase the livability of the city and cut down carbon emissions and so on and so forth. But it's not possible in every city. So for example, it's not possible in cities like New York, where the residential and the industrial residential and industrial areas are completely different. So it's not possible in cities like New York. But what is possible in Indian cities, where such kind of solutions can be implemented, right? Is that possible in Indian cities? If not, what is the solution to increase the livability factor?
Okay. Yes.
This question is to Prasad. In your understanding of the city, do you think, or is there a space to think about justice, or not at all?
Which way do you want to go, Ramaswamy?
I think money. First question, yes. But we need to talk about it because some cities have histories which are 500,000, 2,000 years old. And some cities have been just planned, maybe could take another 50 years. So it's easy for me to say cities are in transition, they are dynamic, changing all the time, it's about people. Yesterday is also past. So it's very critical. But without, I would say, the perspective of history, we would be making mistakes if we are not planning for the future. So, shall I answer the other question? So, you said something about Bangalore.
Why do you need to plan?
Yeah, so the idea was that the initial planners were not urban planners for cities. They were probably botanists or geographers. Where did this practice or profession come from? Where did the doctor and MBBS come from? Then the societies changed and we defined education and professional practice. We said, okay, these people will plan the city. The government will run the country, rule the country. It's a ruling party. You keep saying ruling party, ruling party. What rule? Who are we ruling? So I would say that the answer to your question is that can we apply a model on Indian cities and then say, for example, if somebody tells me shared mobility is a global $1 billion market, and I say that 20 years ago there were shared taxis in Hyderabad, there were 7-seaters shared, 7-seaters in Chitimatla. In many Indian cities we were sharing space and mobility was shared. We need not have waited for an app like Uber or Ola to tell us that you have to share mobility is a $1 trillion market or something. As if we needed to be told about it. So if we look at public behavior, I come back to your question on Bangalore and then your question on infrastructure and density. It's that it's a kind of a relationship between governments and people. And some laws or rules you plan or you kind of enforce or you think, it may be coming from an authoritarian kind of a history that we can plan for people and all that. But without public behavior, no plans will succeed. The response I know. So what do we plan? So mixed use. Most of the Indian history, historical cities, they're mixed. So the rigid planning, land use planning, let us talk about it. Let's talk about it. Where did we go wrong or go on a different path or fail? I think we need to talk about it. So, I'll come back to your question. For Venu, the risk is that there are 1 crore people in Hyderabad. There are 2 crore people in Delhi or Mumbai. Total population of Telangana is 3 crores. 3 crores? 4 crores. So that means 2 cities, you add Mumbai and Delhi, 4 crores. This is just too much. So if an outbreak happens of a disease, we are not talking about impact of noise pollution, infected water supply, the amount of gastrointestinal diseases in the cities, what impact does it have on productivity, how much travel time we spend, in Mumbai and Delhi, what is the economy lost in that, what we could have done better. So the idea was that because of the dealing in the practice between public health and urban planning, I would still say that if we have good water supply, sewage, 5 pillars we say, water supply, sewage, solid waste, stormwater management and transportation, power, 6. Then at least 50% of the major public health issues will be resolved. So infrastructure still plays a key role in large congested cities. Efficient infrastructure management will cut down the risk a lot, health issues. Density, because Hyderabad has rules and regulations, don't have FAR cap, no density regulation. So how do you control densities when your economic hubs are in and around cities, or your the companies which control, or the people who control these enterprises live in cities, the investment comes back into cities, so vested investment is vested is there always in the city. It's political, it's economic. So I feel that without changing that, it has to be a policy or a method of governance and then redoing things in a particular, whether it's through mobility, if you build autobahns or freeways or expressways or superhighways or quadrilaterals, or do rail-based mobility and come up with a pattern which reduces the pressure on the cities is what my base would be. For Bangalore, the economic things, including Hyderabad and probably some other cities, the economic growth outpaced the speed at which we were planning. No doubt about it. But if you not have a plan, a large part of the land use plan or the statutory plan is not followed in any city. It's not just Bangalore or Hyderabad. So the markets have come where they were not planned. In Delhi also it happened. Until the Supreme Court came and said that you seal it, and then we started thinking about it. So I feel that water becomes a key issue, including your solid waste management. A major issue right now is a burning problem for the Bangalore exercise we did. Is I talked to you about the elevation and the continuing growing size of Bangalore, and how much water can you keep pumping in from what far distance and at what cost. So if we don't plan, I think it would become a little worse. So probably it's just to mitigate it to a certain extent, of course with the feeling that we need to do it, so we have to plan, so we have to plan. But I think we should keep on continuing to plan and keep on changing.
The question is of distribution of the resources being the same.
Yeah.
Certain groups in certain urban agglomerations have greater access to those resources.
Absolutely right.
So if there is some kind of distributive equality, then
see, the idea was, if you create an infrastructure fund where you say you allow the high rises to come with the distribution, they pay more. So you have a kind of idea again, rich will pay for the rest of the city, or you allow them to take advantage of a part of the city or the city life. City life is attracting people for various reasons. It's also the concentration of wealth and to safeguard that wealth. So if that happens, if our planning rules, whether they are archaic or the super modern changing planning system we have now in the country, is to redistribute that wealth taken from that in the form of a tax or a revenue charge. And that is being tried, but it's not being practiced properly. It is possible, we need to really do that. Because the people, it's a political thing. It's not the politics of political parties and political groups. The people who are powerful and money, they will transcend the various barriers which are old, historical, traditional, whatever barriers also will be broken. There are people on the street now entering, there is a huge market on street food. And there are people who make a lot of money in there. They are not necessarily the poor people. The poor people were the ones who were originally selling on the street. So there are people who get in the caravans and now make $1 lakh or $2 lakh per month. So it's getting complicated.
Yeah. I mean, to respond to both questions, so one is like a question on whether informal systems are susceptible to hijacked by traditional, this transaction. In the sense that with a kind of a difference of informal systems lends the whole thing in perpetuation of caste or ethnicity. It does. There's no doubt about it. But that is not to say that the formal system will erase it. It doesn't. I mean, you see work cultures in formal systems, you see very clearly that caste is maintained. That is one. The second point in that is that urban life kind of creates new opportunities of practice. For example, your Rent Control Act in Mumbai, Rent Control Act was basically which kind of capped rents on property. It not only capped rents, but second thing it did was it prohibited eviction of people. So the tenants got a sense of property. They couldn't be evicted, and the rents were kind of capped. So there were no new landlords. People did not build new houses because it was not profitable to do that. At the same time, there was no transaction possible because you can inherit, you can give your property to a son, daughter, or wife, but you cannot sell the property to somebody else. The landlord cannot sell, nor the tenant does. Now, this is a very unique situation where transaction is not possible. That you can't sell, tenants can't sell without permission of landlord. Landlord will not give permission because landlord doesn't get anything. So it's a kind of a trap. It's a kind of a, and no banks kind of give any kind of a loan for, because there is no mortgage possible. Because there are multiple people owning the same property. Now, to get out of this situation, there is a very interesting informal system that kind of gets developed, which is an agreed practice called the public, which is basically that if I am a tenant and if he is a landlord, if I have a property and I have to sell it to this person, I will sell the property, but 1/3 of that amount will go to the landlord. Only then the sale is possible. Now, that 1/3 is elastic. It depends on what is the price of property, how much I have negotiated, how much effort. So it can become 1/5, or it can become a part of it. It can become 23% or whatever. So that is it. So it's not big. Sometimes I do it without the knowledge of the. Sometimes so there are all these kinds of processes. So the urban environment, urban life creates many more kind of complex practices, which can be seen beyond the caste, the work-based practices. There are these 2 points. And one, of course, they are acceptable, but it's not as a formal systems work. It doesn't. Justice question, I mean, again 2 points. One is the scale at which you want to mobilize justice. The idea of morality is very different, and it is kind of very specific to cultures, to times, to people, to geographies, to histories. So it's kind of the value to say environment that we associate today. That value is very different 20 years before. There is no discussion around 20 years before. Very, very different. It's kind of, it has a specific marker of time when the discussion starts. Or the questions of various kinds of rights that one knows. So I think I'm wanting to say that moralities are they have a historicity. They come in specific histories. They come in specific times, certain job, all valid. They're all valid. Now, if one speaks of universal idea of justice, then that is a utopic condition. And that in that justice, change is not possible. And that when change is not possible, then it's kind of for example, a robotic utopia. That all work will be taken up by robots, so what do people do? people playing football. That kind of thing. So that should be the ambition, that should be the aspiration, that's the excellent mobilizer, the universal idea of justice. But I feel that justice has to be specific to the people who are like if I demand my right of eating beef, then the right of the animal not to be slaughtered. It's always this kind of opposition. So I feel at that particular instance, what is required, what is guided, that's I think is very powerful to be mobilized, it has to be mobilized very strategically, but also very tactically to kind of snatch what is otherwise not there. And I'm saying that universal idea of justice is important. However, justices have a specific responsibility, and I think for me justice is not what is expected, but justice for me is a tactic that I mobilize to snatch what I do not have.
You have to close Ramaswamy will close.
Just half a minute. Prasad talked about the transactional capacity of spaces. One thought that I've had for many years is the communal capacity of space, or communal as in community, not communal right. So the communal character of spaces. So when I'm walking the city, I see a staircase in front of a building, that's a communal space. I can visualize a family or friends hanging out there and so on, or having a party on the stairs. I'm attracted to it. But what we are witnessing now is the shrinkage and the disappearance of communal spaces, or more formally public space. The German philosopher, thinker Alexander Kluge, he called public space as the factory of politics. So now we have no more, we don't have pavements, we have gated communities, we have malls, there's no public space. And this morning you said now you can't be in the assembly, in the secretariat, it's 144 all the time. Many cities, in Calcutta or in Delhi, only Jantar Mantar, and that is now also closed. Yeah. So public space is the factory of politics, it's the factory of association, and activists should remember that they are forgotten. When you organize a meeting, it has to be in a public space, not in a hotel or somewhere, And you have to carry a map in your head of public spaces in the city.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.